Hello and welcome to another TouchDesigner tutorial. I'm going to be looking at pops again and expanding on a network we built recently where essentially we added particles every frame of a feedback loop to have this sort of cascading effect where essentially that particle system grows kind of like an array. We're also going to look at how to delete and remove particles from the array and get something that looks like this cool sort of electrical static ball. And actually, even though it looks quite complicated over here, it's actually a reasonably simple network, and we're going to learn quite a lot about different ways of working with particle systems and adding iteratively to these loops, which I think is a really powerful thing to do within TouchDesigner. So I'm going to delete this and let's start off from scratch. For the time being, I'm going to close that side panel because we don't need it for a little bit. And I'm going to start out by adding a few things. We're going to start out with a point, and we're going to plug that point into a random. And random is a really useful tool that we've looked at before for either modifying attributes or actually setting attributes. So in this case, we want to create a velocity attribute, and we're going to do this by selecting set because we don't want to alter any operation that's happened before. We want to create a new attribute, and we're going to call this attribute vel for velocity. And if we bring out let's do a pop2, we can see that we have a vel parameter here, a vel attribute. But right now we just have one value. We actually want to have multiple because, as we saw earlier, that 3D sphere tentacle thing is in XYZ 3D dimensions. So we actually want to have a velocity that could lead us in one of three directions and gives us a value for XYZ velocity. So I'm going to click on this little arrow here and expand that section and say override automatic attribute. I'm going to stick with float, and I want three values here. And what we can see now is I have a vel0, vel1, and vel2, and they're all different. And so this is great. I'm going to change the values because this is essentially a velocity that's going to be applied every frame. We don't want it to be a massive amount of change every frame. And as we add more points, or if we were to change the seed of this point, we can see that it's going to give us these different velocity starting values, which is going to be really useful for powering our system. Let's take a look at what this would actually kind of entail. So I'm going to drag this out to a null, which is going to be just here in case I add anything before my feedback. So take that null into this feedback. And again, I'll take that feedback into a null. I'll call that end FB. And for the time being, I'm not going to add points iteratively. I'm just going to make a move based on this velocity. So I'm going to do a math mix. And in this math mix, I'm going to select A plus B. And so P plus vel. And what we should see, and I'll actually add in a keyboard in before I actually make this change. Connect that to start. Okay, so what we should see is when I actually drag this onto my feedback and initialize it, we can see that my vel is accelerating that particle. It's moving, and it's moving pretty fast. Okay, that's great. So we've got the first section of this piece sorted out. Basically, what our goal is here is to have multiple points sort of spreading out from a central point into this sort of, as we could see earlier, this sort of flower. And we'll add in that change a little bit later. But if we actually want this to populate a line just of this singular point, let's make that happen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a merge here. And again, it's important to make sure we have all of our feedback set up so when we actually start merging points, we don't kill our system. So let's see what happens if I start merging these points. we essentially get a line, and this is because we keep adding and adding to this set of points. So if I go into a chop2, a pop2 viewer, we can see here that that ramp, essentially, that velocity, is growing iteratively every frame, and basically this is leading us in a specific direction. If I was to go into my attribute and change the seed, we would see here, and if I keep doing this, we would see that I'm essentially setting out particles that have their own random starting velocities. So we start getting these channels that sort of come out. So this is really nice. We can also see that right now we're running pretty high in terms of like these amounts of particles we're adding. We're quite quickly adding a lot of particles. And this is okay when we have 1 point, but the next step is we're actually going to add multiple points. So let's just pare back a little bit, and instead of having this point, I'm going to create a point generator. I'm going to set it to circle. I'm going to bring down the number of points to, let's just say for the time being, 20, kind of small. And I also want to set my radius to something that's quite small as well. So let's say like 0.1. And then when I plug this in, we're going to see that we should start having a bunch of randomized velocity values. It might be harder to see in here versus if I actually bring this into a chop2. There we go. So we can see here we have different velocities for each point that have been set up. We actually don't want to really look at P anymore. We will look at vel. So now we can see that this randomized velocity basically allows each of these particles to spread out in a particular way. And as we add more particles, we can see that we're adding multiple, we're adding 10 new particles or 20 new particles, whatever we've set every frame. So what's important here is to have some kind of deletion process. We could add in, as we kind of looked at earlier, a sort of a life attribute that we then add to iteratively, and that can be fun to do. And then you have points kind of disappearing at various times. But what I'm going to do for the time being is I'm just going to work with our delete to create something that allows us to delete these points once they've exceeded a certain boundary. And before I actually delete, I'm going to create a new parameter that's going to take our length from the center. So essentially it's going to be a length check, and when it exceeds that length, it's going to delete that particle. And what this means is that rather than having something just snap out of existence, it's going to create a nice sort of sphere effect. So to do this, I'm going to do A minus B. I'm going to create a quick uniform called center, or just cent in this case. I'm going to set that to a float 3 and have it as 0, 0, 0, which is my central position. I'm then going to say center minus P, and I'm going to call it len for length. I'm then going to just take the length reading of that subtraction and output that. And now I can create a delete. And in this delete, I'm going to go to attribute. In the drop down, we're going to say len. All of the len 0, 1, 2 will all be the same. It returns a value for each of these points, but if we go ahead and look at this, we want to look at len. We'll see that essentially it's just a distance from the center. And so what we want to do is we want to check if it's bigger than a certain value, and right now it's bigger than 0. By default, it's always going to be bigger than 0, so we won't see anything. So let's do something like 4. Okay, when it gets to 4, it's going to delete that particle. And we're going to have this kind of radius effect that stops. You can see it just keeps pulsing out. Okay, so this is sort of the start of that effect. Now what I'm going to do before I add in some more stuff is I'm going to add in a geo. Kind of strobing over here. I'm going to add in a geo. I'm going to add in a render. Actually, I'm going to do a camera viewport because I like that better. I'm going to drag that camera viewport onto my camera. For the time being, let's do a point sprite to texture. Looking pretty good. And then what I will do is I'll drag this onto an out. I'm going to split my screen. I'm going to use a panel. I'm also going to open my parent parameters and customize how big this is. So I'll say 1280 by 720, just so I'm matching my current size. In camera viewport on the camera tab, I'm just going to set panel comp as ... which means I should be able to then move this around, which is great. Okay, now I can press play and I'm going to start this off. So this is fine. You know, it's giving us something that basically radiates out, and I can add in lots more points. Let's do like 200. In this case, I might also just set my radius to 0, because then everything will emanate from the center. There we go. And we can see even just changing the parameter here actually kind of has an interesting effect. If I go up to my parent parameters just to control the camera on the panel tab, I can toggle on this right control as well and the middle mousing, so I can then zoom in and out. And we can then obviously see that as I maneuver this stuff, if I automated that in some way, we're creating some kind of interesting change, which I kind of like. Again, what we could see is if we turn down this velocity, we're going to have things moving out more slowly. So if I turn it down to like 0.01, we'll see that things are moving out much, much more slowly from the center there. What we really want to do is we want to create some kind of change to these elements. So as they sort of span out from the center, something is actually going to happen. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add in a noise. And what I want to control here is going to be my output. My output scope is going to be on velocity here. We can see that's quite a lot. We actually want to tone this down a little bit, or a little lot. We'll turn this down to 0.01. I'm also going to automate this translate, because this is where we'll get the most changes. So let's see. It looks like I'll pop this in abs time.seconds times 0.01. Maybe let's turn this up a little more. Okay, I've lost my attribute scope there. That's what was going on there. Okay, interesting. And let's turn down that again, because that was way too high. Can change this period. Something else we need to do. This is not quite right here. Output. We need to make sure we're outputting 3 values here. Although that still doesn't seem to help us very much. There we go. We want to make sure it's adding, not setting. So I don't quite know what was going on there with my settings, something a little off. But basically, let's actually just recreate this noise just so that you can see it really quickly. To quickly recap, we're going to add in that noise again. And for the time being, we'll leave this page the same. Under output, we'll keep it as combine operation add. We're going to select the attribute output scope as vel. We'll see that that's kind of intense, so a few things we're going to do to smooth this out. We're going to do abs time.seconds times 0.1 to sort of smooth out how fast these changes are happening. And then also what we're going to do is turn this period way down. So let's zoom out there. And what we can see is essentially that velocity is more slowly moving through each of those lines. Let's even turn it down to 0.01. And here should be something a bit more understandable here. And we can turn this value for the amplitude down a little bit. And then we have these sort of octopus-like tentacle lines coming out. Basically what's happening here is the particles are being added iteratively from this central point, but the starting velocity is changing slightly. But once that velocity has been added in, it just keeps adding and adding and sort of expanding out. But the velocity control at the beginning kind of controls that initial point position where we see this moving. So the larger this is, the more offset from that central point it's going to be, which is why we get these sort of slow curves, especially as we start moving the noise a little more slowly. So even slower, let's see what happens there. It's going to look mostly like straight lines. As you see, as we move that up a little bit, we're cycling through that noise, so that initial velocity vector is changing somewhat, which means that the speed that points kind of emanate out is changing, and you get these different sort of patterns, which I really like. Again, you could play with things like the exponent to kind of change up what this effect actually looks like, and rather than having a tentacle effect, you have these things that look sort of like nebulas. I'm not sure I love that effect, but you kind of get the idea that this can be modified to sort of your liking here. Let's stick to this. So I kind of like this. I'm going to make a couple of changes. And so the first change I want to do is I want to expand the radius of my circle just to give us a bit more room here. I'm even going to go to like 3, and I can zoom in. And having this kind of further outward radius, or this further outward edge, it gives it just a bit more time to have this operation happen. And essentially this is kind of the effect. The other thing I'm going to do before I kind of go into the post-production phase is, in the original, we have these sort of larger elements on the outside, these sort of larger circles, which are letting us know where the edges are. And so how I did that was by reversing this delete. So we can also use delete to kind of invert operations. So if I take this delete and I select invert, we get sort of these elements that are just on the edge of our space. So let's take a look at how I would work with that. I will bring that into a geo. Zooming out there. Should be in the same render. So what I'm going to do here is add in a point sprite, drag that on, and I'll make it quite big. So then we can see these outlines here. And it already starts to look a lot more interesting as we have this sort of flower dandelion kind of effect. What I'm going to do to make the kind of curling here a little less intense is I'm going to go into my noise. I'm going to turn it down. And that is starting to look a lot better to me. A final thing I want to do before I actually do some post-production is I'm going to add in a noise and see what that looks like within the feedback loop. Okay, kind of cool. Let's turn down the amplitude a little bit. Let's automate that translate. So let's do abs time dot seconds times 0.1, and we get this slow movement. Now, what I actually kind of want to happen is I don't want to have this be fully noisy. I want to have the noise sort of apply over time. And so what I want is I want to kind of have this combination of this sort of more straight-lined approach with this noisier approach. What I'm going to do is bring in a further math mix. I'm going to plug in both of these objects. So I've got my unprocessed signal and my noise. And what I'm going to do here is plug that into my null, which is going to be my output. I'm going to select the handy mix operation. And with mix, what I can do is I can select two attributes to mix between. So if I select P for the points of this initial input and in1P for the points in this input, we can actually mix between them with this C value. So if I put in a value of 1, we're going to totally distort. And if I put in a value of 0, we're going to have these more kind of straight, less chaotic lines. What I want to do is I want to add in something that's actually going to mix between these. So let's try adding in a length. And so my length is going to mix between these two values. What I actually want to do is I want to switch which one happens first. So let's do my in1P will be at the center and P will be on the outside. And let's also switch this to P for the output attribute scope. So let's see what happens there. We can see it's much noisier in the center before getting more sort of smooth and less chaotic on the outside. What we can do to sort of further smooth this out would be to add in a math. I'm going to just create a new attribute called len scaled. We're going to look at len as our input attribute. Let's switch this to len scaled, and then on this multiply, we can take this down. So we can actually just have this at 0. Or move it up to something higher. So we can mix between these two values. And maybe I sort of messed up here. Maybe I should actually have P first and in1P second. Let's see. Ideally, we want this getting more like noisy as we progress. Okay, there we go. So it starts out sort of not that chaotic, and as we get to the outer edge, we see how more and more noise is being added in. If we go to our noise, we can play around with things like the period, which we'll see will kind of smooth this out a little bit to make it less chaotic. You can even change that amplitude down so that the effect is less sort of obnoxiously in your face. But this is kind of like a nice way of mixing multiple layers kind of subtly within these pop networks, which I really like to do. And we can see that we have a bit of a flickering from some of these objects now that noise attribute has been added in. So we could also kind of go in and let's uninvert that. And what we actually want to do is flip it. And let's do like 2.9 or even 2.99. So we just have this, basically just so we have this extra point or two that's kind of filtering through, so we don't actually have that really chaotic effect as things are cycling around. Okay, so we are nearly there. In terms of some post-production, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this render, I'm going to copy it because I want to sort of process both of these slightly differently. So I'm going to take here, I'll take Geo1, and here I will take Geo2. So now we shouldn't have those points on top. I'm not going to do anything fancy here. I'm just going to add in a bloom. Get to a zoom that I like. Turn down that pre-gamma level. And what I actually like to do when I work with bloom is just view the bloom, so I can kind of see how that might apply when I add things together. Turn down these radiuses. Play with the gamma a little bit. Turn the intensity up very slightly. And now let's bring in the input plus bloom. Turn down that bloom intensity. We're just really giving ourselves just a little bit of kind of extra brightness here. We can also turn down a few of these things so it's not quite so bright in the center. And then let's do the same thing with this. Let's just view this on its own for the time being. We can be a bit more heavy-handed with this bloom. So let's play with that, turn down that. We want a bigger, we want a more kind of pronounced effect. Play with that S-curve and the fill. Okay. Now let's comp these together. Do an over, bring in some of that original, you know, this one's too intense, so I'm going to take down that minimum bloom radius. Yeah, that's looking much better. So now we have this sort of shiny edge to the expanding sphere. We can also play around with turning this point sprite down a little bit. Or sorry, we want to actually turn the point sprite on the smaller points down. So we can do something like 0.6 or whatever sort of fits the vibe you're going for. And then you can play around with this system sort of as much as you like. What I really like about this type of system in Pops is I find it really scalable in the fact that I can sort of work with a point and basically set up that initial logic, and then when I'm ready I can play around with something that's a lot more intense here. I'm actually going to switch this up to a sphere. And so that should be a little bit better and have everything zeroed, so everything's going to come out. Maybe not. I could set more random attributes there. So let's just have it at 0.01 and we get this interesting effect. And obviously you can play around with adding in much more kind of logic. You could have kind of like depth parameters, so things might die before they reach the outside. You can kind of add in more logic there. You could also have different sort of logic around how you mix these lengths together and things like that. But overall, you could you can do some fun stuff, or you could automate this to be more like a an audio reactive type thing. The possibilities are endless. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. There are going to be many more to come. I'm going to be launching a course where I teach all about pops coming up. So stay tuned, and I'll be posting about that on my social media and YouTube channel really soon.